We've all seen the ideal planning cycle. The whole idea. I grew up on Hanson and Moen. Everyone's got a slight variation, but the theme is the same. We like to plan. Something happens after that plan. Then we like to evaluate it, hopefully put some controls in place, and the feedback goes around in a loop. The thing is, we all know that while that's good in theory and it was great in ACFI 102, it's not exactly how it plays out in reality. So something that's more likely to happen is that we go to plan or do the budget or forecast, we rally the troops, we get ready to fight uphill to get something plausible in place. Often it takes too long to do in full detail, so we fall back on an acceptable shortcut. And one of those things is, if we all sat down in an open forum, relaxed situation over a pint or a glass of red, we'd probably all sit there and say, you know what, if I was to do a proper forecast, it's going to take me a good couple of months, probably 3 months or more. And I don't have 3 or 4 months. I've got to get that done, at least on a monthly cycle. I've got to get it done. So we tend to fall back on shortcuts. We take averages. We look at higher level data. We do all sorts of things that we try to, take a little bit of time and bring it back in. Then the evaluation part, well, it's usually limited, takes place in the eye of the storm, a few days mid-month. You might get a week if you're lucky. And then the control-wise, we make some recommendations on how things would have been different if we'd steered a little earlier. All the while, though, that whole performance part, the business just keeps going. It's changing, adapting, and we're forced as finance people to pick up the slack and just make it happen. So we end up with a situation where, and I'll leave it up to you what that censored feedback is, but it's often, not pleasant, but, I have 126 days until my holidays is usually a common flavor. But the idea is that it would have been better if we could be proactive and get in early and that we could guide those changes, but often it's a little too late. So what tends to happen is it lags rather than leads, and it requires a high degree of energy. And correct me if anyone's here that's got it all down pat, I take my hat off to you. Typically it takes a high degree of energy from the teams to sort of get in there, really lift up and just make it happen. It's a big deal. Why is it so? So in session 1, for anyone that was in session 1 of this series, there was this broad opinion that perhaps budgets and forecasts were taking on less of value because, there's a saying here in Australia, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. The effort to go through the process, there's this gray area on the reward. And from my perspective, to answer that, really, it's management doesn't have the tools they need to effectively run the business. We often invest large amounts on ERPs, CRMs, and other transaction systems because we want to maintain audit integrity or help our teams be able to follow due process. But almost always, as finance, we're forced to make do with our existing planning system, which almost always boils down to Excel. As we mentioned, 90% of CFOs said their number one finance reporting tool was Excel. And that was a survey conducted this year. Throwing more headcount at the problem also doesn't solve it. I know from personal experience, you get to a point where there's choke points, and we'll sort of go through that as we explore through the workshop. But there's choke points where just throwing more people to solve the problem, the logistics build up, and at the end of the day, it doesn't always make it quicker. And the final point there is our finance milestones are relatively fixed in time. They can't be pushed back without decent penalties. The board wants their data. You can't just turn around and say, yeah, look, we're having a little bit of trouble, so let's push it back. It's just not an option. So that sets the scene.